A homeless soldier arrested for a simple trespassing case stuns the courtroom with his words, "The land I'm accused of trespassing on, it belongs to me." But as his story unfolds, it becomes clear, this isn't just about a homeless man. It's about a conspiracy, a theft worth millions, and a system built to erase people like him. A shady corporation didn't just steal his home, they tried to wipe out his existence. Now, as he searches for the truth, witnesses disappear, threats rise, and his life is in danger. But the real question remains, can one homeless veteran take down an entire corporate empire, or will this fight become his last battle? Where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. If this story hooked you in, imagine what's coming next. Hit that subscribe button now and turn on notifications, because trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. Like this video, share it with your friends, and let's spread the truth together. The air in the courtroom was thick, a silence so suffocating it felt alive. Every eye was fixed on the man standing at the defendant's table, a man who didn't belong in a place like this. Daniel Cooper. His jacket, frayed at the edges, clung to his thin frame like a memory of better days. His boots, worn and scuffed, carried the weight of years spent wandering. A soldier once, now just a ghost of the man he used to be. The charge: trespassing. The prosecutor's voice dripped with certainty as they laid out their case, making Daniel sound like nothing more than a vagrant who had crossed the wrong line. But when the judge turned to him, asking if he had anything to say in his defense, Daniel did something no one expected. He lifted his head, his tired eyes locking onto the judge's, and spoke. "I know why I'm here." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. A quiet defiance, an unshakable certainty. But before you pass judgment, there's something you need to know. He let the words hang in the air for a moment, the tension growing with every heartbeat. "The land I'm accused of trespassing on." He exhaled slowly, steadying himself. "It belongs to me." The courtroom exploded, gasps, whispers, a sudden wave of murmurs crashing through the crowd like a storm. The judge slammed his gavel, demanding order, but the damage was done. How could a man with nothing claim to own land that someone else had called the police over? The judge narrowed his eyes, scrutinizing Daniel. "Mr. Cooper, are you saying you own this property? Do you have proof?" Daniel's fingers curled around the rough edge of the defendant's table. He hesitated, then nodded. "I can explain everything," he said, his voice unwavering. "But it's a long story." Daniel stood in the silence that followed, his gaze distant, as if looking past the courtroom walls and into a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. "I wasn't always like this," he began, his voice steady but weighted with the ghosts of yesterday. For a moment, the courtroom faded away, replaced by the warm glow of a childhood spent in a small Indiana town. His parents were farmers, not wealthy, but rich in laughter and love. He had grown up running through golden fields, his hands learning the roughness of hard work long before he understood its true value. When he turned 18, he enlisted. The uniform became his second skin, discipline his new way of life. Serving his country wasn't just a duty, it was an honor, a promise to build something greater than himself. And for a while, he did. When his service ended, Daniel poured his strength into something new, a small carpentry business. His hands, once trained for war, now built things meant to last. He crafted furniture that people admired, that they paid for with gratitude. He bought a modest piece of land, a place to call his own, where he imagined building a home, a life. But dreams, like buildings, can collapse when the foundation cracks. The 2008 financial crisis hit like an earthquake. Clients disappeared, orders stopped, money drained from his accounts faster than he could keep up. Then the house went, then the shop, then everything, He tried to hold on, clawing at any job he could find. But when the world is drowning, no one reaches out for a man who's already sinking. One day, he realized he had nothing left but an old truck, a photograph of his parents, and a small Bible. Things that couldn't be sold, things that tethered him to who he used to be. That's when he became invisible. Not overnight, but piece by piece. People stopped making eye contact. Store owners shooed him away before he could even step inside. The world had moved on, and he was just a shadow on the pavement. "I never gave up," Daniel said, his voice firm, his fingers gripping the edge of the table as if holding on to the past itself. A scoff from the prosecution cut through the moment. "Your Honor, this is a touching story, but unless the defendant is arguing that nostalgia is a legal defense, I fail to see the relevance." A murmur rippled through the gallery, some agreeing, others uneasy with the cold dismissal. The judge leaned forward, tapping a finger against the bench. "Mr. Cooper, is there a point to this?" Daniel lifted his chin, his jaw tightening. "Yes, Your Honor. I'm getting to it." Daniel exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the table's edge as the memory surged forward, raw and unshaken by time. It was late. I had just left the shelter, heading for the only corner of the city that still felt like mine. His voice was steady, but there was something beneath it, an ache, a weight, a story not yet finished. The streets were quiet, empty except for the neon glow of signs flickering in the distance. He hadn't planned to go there, not really, but his feet had carried him forward, guided by a pull he didn't question. Then he saw it. His land. Or at least, what used to be. It should have been a stretch of quiet earth, untouched, waiting for him like it always had. Instead, it was covered in steel beams and foundation trenches, surrounded by tall fences and no trespassing signs. Floodlights bathed the area in a harsh glow, illuminating construction materials stacked like tombstones over what had once been his future. I didn't think. I just moved. The words came out barely above a whisper, but the room seemed to lean in closer. He climbed the fence, not out of recklessness, not to make trouble, but because he had to. Because that land was his, because something deep in his chest twisted at the thought of it being erased forever. "I walked the grounds," he continued, his throat tightening. "I stepped over dirt I once called home. I tried to see it the way it used to be, the way I had imagined it when I bought it. But all I could see were strangers building a life I was supposed to have." Then he saw the tree. The old oak, the one he used to sit under when the land was his. Everything else had changed, had been ripped away or reshaped, but that tree stood untouched, a single survivor in a battlefield of concrete and steel. So I sat beneath it. He let the words linger in the air, let them press against the silence. I wasn't trying to cause trouble. I wasn't there to fight or destroy anything. I just wanted to feel close to it again, just for a little while. The image hung heavy over the courtroom, a man who had lost everything, clinging to the last unbroken piece of his past. Then came the flood of harsh voices, the sharp beams of flashlights cutting through the dark. Security had found him. They didn't care who he was. They didn't care what the land meant to him. All they saw was a trespasser. The judge's gavel struck once, but it wasn't enough to quiet the storm. Gasps, murmurs, questions whispered between those who thought they already knew the answer. Could a man with nothing still hold on to something as significant as land, or had the world already decided that he didn't deserve it? The judge studied Daniel, his expression unreadable. The weight of the room pressed down on him, the gavel resting heavy in the judge's grip. Finally, he spoke. "Mr. Cooper, if this land was truly yours, why didn't you fight for it?" A simple question, a brutal one. Daniel let out a breath, steady but strained, his fingers tightening around the rough wood of the table. He lifted his gaze, not defiant, not pleading, but exhausted. I did, he said. The courtroom stilled. I tried. He could feel their judgment in the silence, 1,000 unspoken accusations hidden behind narrowed eyes. He forced himself to hold their gaze. You think people listen to a man like me? A man without an address, without a phone number, without the kind of proof that fits neatly into your system? His voice wasn't loud, but it carved through the silence like a blade. You can't fight when no one even sees you. The memories clawed at him, sharp and bitter. The first time he went to the county office, standing in line behind men in suits, mothers with restless children. When it was his turn, the clerk barely looked at him before dismissing him with a thin-lipped shake of the head. No record of ownership under your name, sir. Are you sure you bought the land? The words burned as much now as they had then. Of course, he was sure. But the paperwork was gone, lost, misplaced, or maybe buried so deep no one wanted to dig it back up. He tried again, and again, and again, each time the same response. Sir, if you have no proof, there's nothing we can do. So he became a ghost, his land, his dreams, his name, all erased, as if they had never existed. Someone built on my land as if I had never been there at all, Daniel said, his voice steady despite the fire beneath it. The judge leaned back, his fingers tapping against the bench. He studied Daniel for a long moment before turning to the court clerk. Verify his claim. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. The prosecutor scoffed, rising from his seat. Your Honor, this is absurd. We are wasting valuable court time entertaining a man who... The judge's gavel struck down, hard. We will verify his claim, the judge repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. The prosecutor bit back his frustration and sat down, his jaw tight. The tension in the courtroom simmered as the judge called for adjournment. Daniel didn't move right away. He just sat there, his hands resting on the worn wood before him. For the first time in years, someone was willing to listen. But listening wasn't the same as winning, and if he lost now, if the system that had failed him once did it again, there would be nothing left. As the courtroom emptied around him, Daniel remained seated, staring down at his hands. This wasn't just about proving he had owned the land. It was about proving that he had ever mattered at all. The judge's words echoed in Daniel's mind as he stepped out of the courtroom. 1 week. 7 days to prove he existed. 7 days to find a past that had been erased. The weight of it settled on his chest like a stone. There was only one person who could help. Henry Walker. Henry had been there the day Daniel signed the papers, the day he walked that land with a heart full of plans. Henry had seen it all. If anyone could vouch for him, it was Henry. But Henry was gone. It had been years since they last spoke, since life had pulled them in different directions, each man struggling to stay afloat, and now Daniel had to find him in a city that swallowed people whole. He walked for hours, retracing old paths, shelters, soup kitchens, street corners where familiar faces used to be. The wind was sharp, biting at his skin as he moved from one place to the next, asking, searching, hoping. Most people shook their heads, some barely spared him a glance, but then, a flicker of hope. An older woman at a downtown shelter narrowed her eyes, her fingers pressing against her temple as she tried to remember. Henry Walker? She repeated. Daniel's breath caught. Yeah, tall guy, big laugh. Always talked about fixing things up. She nodded slowly. I remember Henry. Used to come around here a few years ago. Helped fix the back door when it jammed. Good man. Daniel swallowed hard. Do you know where he is now? The woman sighed, shaking her head. Last I heard he was headed west. Said he was looking for work on a ranch somewhere. West. The word landed heavy. The entire western half of the country stretched in his mind. Too vast, too uncertain, too far. Daniel nodded, forcing gratitude into his voice. Thank you. He stepped outside, the cold settling deeper in his bones. 1 week, and the one man who could save him might as well be on the other side of the world. Daniel sat on a worn-out bench in the park, his shoulders slumped, hands clasped together. The city hummed around him, cars passing, people talking, life moving forward while he sat frozen in time. His breath curled in the cold night air, but he barely noticed. He was out of Leeds, out of time, west. Henry had gone west. It might as well have been another planet. He let his head drop back, staring up at the sky, searching for answers among the scattered stars. Dan? The voice came from behind him. Rough, familiar. His chest tightened as he turned. Standing a few feet away, wearing a jacket that had seen too many winters, was Henry Walker. For a second, Daniel just stared. It had been years, but the face was unmistakable. The same sharp eyes, the same wary expression. Older, thinner, but still Henry. Daniel pushed himself up. Henry? Henry let out a low chuckle. Damn, it really is you. Daniel stepped closer, his mind scrambling to catch up. Where the hell have you been? Henry shrugged. Here, there. Work dried up, so I kept moving. But let's talk about you. I heard about the case. About the land. Daniel exhaled sharply. Then you know I need you. You were there when I bought it, Henry. I need someone to back me up. Henry's expression darkened. He ran a hand through his unkempt hair, shifting uncomfortably. Yeah, about that. Something in his voice sent a chill down Daniel's spine. Dan, your land, it's gone. The words landed like a punch. Daniel's jaw tightened. I know it's gone, Henry. That's why I'm fighting for it. Henry shook his head. No, you don't get it. They didn't just take it. They sold it. Legally. On paper, it's not yours anymore. Daniel felt the world tilt slightly. That's not possible. Henry let out a bitter laugh. You think the system cares about what's possible? He exhaled, his breath curling in the cold. You didn't have an address, Dan. You didn't get the tax notices. As far as the county was concerned, your land was abandoned. Daniel clenched his fists. So they just gave it away? No, Henry said, his voice dropping. They sold it. For nothing. Pennies on the dollar. And guess who bought it? Daniel's stomach twisted before the name even left Henry's lips. Harland and Company. A real estate giant. A company known for swallowing up land, flipping it into luxury developments, leaving the little guy with nothing. Daniel's chest rose and fell in slow, controlled breaths. He could feel his heartbeat hammering in his ears. There's something else, Henry added, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. Daniel turned to him, his eyes sharp. What? Henry glanced around, lowering his voice. Something you need to know about that land. Daniel's pulse quickened. There was something Henry wasn't saying, and from the way his friend's jaw tensed whatever it wasn't good. Daniel stared at Henry, his pulse drumming in his ears. Stolen. Not just taken. Not just lost to time or bad luck. Stolen. Tell me everything, he said, his voice low, controlled, but Henry could hear the storm behind it. Henry exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. It wasn't just some normal sale, Dan. The county didn't follow the rules. They were supposed to wait a year before putting your land up for auction. They pushed it through in 6 months. Daniel's chest tightened. That's illegal. Henry nodded grimly. Yeah, but it's not just your land. Daniel frowned. What do you mean? Henry shifted his stance, lowering his voice. Harland and Company's been doing this for years. I've heard stories. People who lost land overnight. Same pattern, same loopholes. They don't just buy properties. They rig the system to make sure they get them cheap. They have people inside the county offices bending the rules in their favor. Daniel swallowed hard. It made sense. Harland and Company wasn't just a real estate firm. They were vultures, a powerful, well-oiled machine that thrived on loopholes, technicalities, and the silence of people too broken to fight back. They counted on you being gone, Dan, Henry continued. They knew you wouldn't get the letters, wouldn't have a lawyer to challenge it. So they rushed the process and scooped it up before you could do anything about it. Daniel felt his hands curl into fists. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a paperwork error. It was a setup. He exhaled, steadying himself. If I'm going to win this, I need proof. Henry nodded. Yeah, and that's not going to be easy. Daniel looked out into the distance, his mind racing. Proof. He needed county records. He needed a crack in the foundation of Harland and Company's scheme. And if they had done this to others, that meant there were more victims out there. More people who might be willing to talk. Daniel turned back to Henry, his eyes sharp, unwavering. Then we start digging. Henry wasn't the only one who had heard the rumors. Daniel needed proof, and proof required someone who knew how to dig. Enter Joe Carter, an investigator with a reputation for sniffing out corporate corruption. He wasn't the kind of guy who wore a badge or played by the rules. He was the kind of guy you called when the system was rigged against you. They met in a diner, the kind where the coffee tasted like burnt regret and the booths smelled like old leather. Joe was already flipping through a thick folder when Daniel and Henry sat across from him. I started looking into Harland and Company the second I heard their name, Joe said, tossing a document across the table. And guess what? Your story isn't unique. Daniel picked up the paper, his eyes scanning the words, but Joe was already talking again. Harland has been pulling the same stunt all over the state. Dozens of properties flagged as abandoned, suspiciously early. People barely had time to respond before the county pushed them into foreclosure. And somehow, every time, Harland and Company ended up with the winning bid. Daniel clenched his jaw. How is that even legal? Joe smirked. It's not. They broke the law. He tapped another document. Your land? It was flagged as abandoned in 6 months. Legally, they were supposed to wait a full year. They rushed the process, made sure no one questioned it, and lined everything up for a quick sale. Henry let out a low whistle. Damn, they didn't even try to hide it. They didn't have to, Joe said. Most people in your situation don't fight back. The county office probably didn't even question it. Just another abandoned lot, just another homeless guy lost in the system. It's a perfect scam. Daniel's grip tightened on the paper. It wasn't just about him anymore. This was bigger. This was theft, coordinated, systematic, designed to prey on the people least able to fight back. For the first time, a flicker of something stirred inside him. Hope. He had them. But then, a different kind of flicker caught his eye, reflected in the diner's window, parked across the street. A black SUV. It had been there when he arrived. He had seen it before. Once near the shelter. Again, outside the courthouse. Now, here. His pulse slowed, cold and steady. Joe noticed his shift in focus and followed his gaze. Friends of yours? Joe asked. Daniel didn't answer. Henry frowned. They've been watching you? Daniel nodded once. Seems like it. Joe leaned back, shaking his head. Well, that's never a good sign. The three of them sat in silence for a moment, watching the SUV like it was some kind of caged animal, waiting to see if it would move. It didn't. Henry exhaled through his nose. You know what this means, right? Daniel nodded. They weren't just digging in the right places. The first strike came in the dead of night. Daniel had barely drifted into sleep when the sound of shattering glass jolted him awake. Then came the screams. He sat up fast, heart hammering, as the acrid scent of smoke clawed its way into his lungs. Flames flickered outside the window, their orange glow casting jagged shadows on the walls. The shelter was on fire. Daniel threw off the thin blanket and bolted for the hallway. Smoke curled through the corridors, thick and choking. Residents coughed and stumbled toward the exits. Somewhere, a baby was crying. His military instincts kicked in. "Stay calm," he shouted, guiding an elderly man toward the door. "Get outside, move now!" People pushed and scrambled, but the staff did their best to keep order. Sirens wailed in the distance, but by the time the fire trucks arrived, the damage had been done. The courtyard was blackened and scorched, the flames having devoured a storage shed, part of the fence, and a section of the sleeping quarters. Miraculously, no one was hurt. But the message was clear. This wasn't an accident. Henry found Daniel standing near the burned wreckage, his fists clenched at his sides. "They did this," Henry muttered, his voice low, furious. "Those bastards did this." Daniel said nothing. He didn't need to. They both knew who was behind it. Joe showed up an hour later, shoving a file into Daniel's hands before he even had a chance to speak. "Forget the fire for a second," Joe said, his expression sharp. "Because I just found something worse." Daniel opened the folder. His eyes skimmed the contents, then stopped. A geological survey. The date on the document was from years ago, before the land was ever sold, before Daniel lost everything. And there it was, in black and white. Harland and Company knew. They had known exactly what was beneath the soil long before they acquired the land. And now, so did Daniel. He exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. "This isn't just about stealing land, is it?" he asked. Joe shook his head. "It's about what's buried under it." Henry let out a low whistle. "Well, well, well," he muttered. "Looks like they didn't just screw you, Dan." They struck gold. Daniel didn't blink. Gold, silver, rare earth minerals. Harland and Company hadn't just stolen a piece of land from a homeless man, they had stolen a fortune. And they would do anything to keep it, getting too close. Daniel sat in stunned silence, staring at the document in his hands. Gold, silver, rare earth minerals. He had fought for this land because it was his, because it was supposed to be his home, because it was all he had left of the man he used to be. But now he realized he had been fighting for something far bigger. "They knew," he murmured, his grip tightening on the paper. "They knew all along." Joe nodded. "They had a geological survey done years before the auction. They knew the land was worth a fortune before they even set foot in that courthouse." Daniel exhaled slowly. Millions, maybe billions. Harland and Company had never been interested in building a luxury development. That was just a cover. "They needed to get rid of you," Joe continued. "Not just because you owned the land, but because you were the only thing standing between them and a gold mine." Henry shook his head, letting out a low whistle. "They must have thought you were dead, Dan, or that you'd never come back. When you did, they panicked." Daniel could feel it now. Why they had rushed the auction, why they had buried the records, why they had fought so hard to erase him from the system. This wasn't a courtroom dispute anymore. This was a heist, a corporate empire built on stolen land. His land. Henry leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with something close to admiration. "Well, they screwed up, didn't they?" Daniel blinked. "How do you figure?" Henry grinned. "Because you're still standing. And now, you know exactly what they're hiding." Daniel met his gaze, a slow, steady determination rising inside him. They had stolen from him. They had tried to erase him. They had set fire to a shelter full of people who had nothing. And now, he was going to burn them to the ground. Natalie Kane wasn't just any witness. She was the key, a former legal assistant at Harland and Company. She had spent years buried in the company's paperwork, quietly watching as they manipulated auctions, bribed officials, and erased people like Daniel from existence. But she had stayed silent. Until now. Daniel, Joe, and Henry sat across from her in a dimly lit back room of a small law office, away from prying eyes. The tension in the air was thick. Natalie's fingers trembled slightly as she placed a flash drive on the table. "Everything's on here," she said, voice barely above a whisper. Emails, contracts, internal memos. It's all there. Proof that they rigged the auction. Proof that they knew about the minerals. Proof that they've done this to others too. Joe picked up the drive carefully, like it was a loaded weapon. If this is real, it's enough to sink them, he muttered. Daniel watched Natalie closely. She looked afraid. Her eyes darted toward the window as if she expected someone to come bursting through it. You don't have to do this, Daniel said, his voice low, steady. If you testify, they'll come after you. She let out a bitter laugh. They already have. Natalie knew what kind of people she was dealing with. She had spent too long watching them work, knowing what happened to people who got in their way. Still, she nodded. I'll testify. Joe exhaled, a grin pulling at the corner of his mouth. Then we've got them. 2 days later, Natalie was gone. She didn't show up to the courthouse, didn't answer her phone. Joe drove to her apartment. It was empty, no signs of struggle, just vanished, as if she had never existed. Daniel stood outside, fists clenched, his breath slow and controlled. They got to her, Henry muttered, his voice dark. Joe shook his head. Either she ran, or they made her disappear. Either way, we just lost our strongest witness. A cold realization settled over Daniel. Harland and Company had tried to erase him. Now, they had erased her, and if they could make a person disappear that easily, what else were they capable of? The fight wasn't just Daniel's anymore. Word spread. His story was everywhere. News outlets picked it up. Homeless veteran fights to reclaim stolen land. People started listening. Veterans groups, activists, reporters, they showed up. Some protested outside the courthouse, holding signs that read, "Justice for Cooper." Others flooded social media, demanding an investigation. Harland and Company had buried plenty of people before, but they had never faced something like this. The world was watching now, but without Natalie, the case was still balanced on a knife's edge. And then, she came back. Daniel was pacing outside the courthouse on the morning of the hearing when a familiar voice called his name. He turned and froze. Natalie stood a few feet away, looking exhausted, but alive. I couldn't run forever, she said, her voice hoarse but steady. I'm ready to testify. Daniel let out a slow breath. They had their witness back. Inside the courtroom, the tension was electric. Natalie took the stand. She didn't hesitate, didn't waver. She told everything. She exposed the forged auction documents, the emails detailing bribes to county officials, the secret geological reports proving Harland and Company knew the land was worth millions before they ever touched it. The prosecutor for Harland and Company objected, again and again, but the evidence was too overwhelming. When she finished, the courtroom sat in stunned silence. Then the judge turned to Daniel. Mr. Cooper, he said, his voice firm, this court finds that Harland and Company unlawfully manipulated the auction of your property. The sale is hereby invalidated. A gasp rippled through the crowd. The judge's gavel slammed down. Ownership of the land is restored to you. For a second, Daniel couldn't move. The words hit like a wave, drenching him in something unfamiliar. Victory. The gallery erupted. Cheers, shouts, applause. Henry clapped Daniel on the back, grinning. Joe let out a low whistle, shaking his head in disbelief. Natalie gave him a small nod, her expression tired but relieved. But Daniel wasn't smiling, because he knew the war wasn't over. The judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, he continued, based on the overwhelming evidence of corruption, this court recommends a federal investigation into Harland and Company's business practices. That's when the color drained from the prosecutor's face. Because this wasn't just about Daniel's land anymore. This was about tearing down an empire. The fall of Harland and Company was swift and brutal. With the judge's ruling, the dam broke. Federal investigators raided the corporation's headquarters, seizing documents, hard drives, and financial records. What they found was worse than anyone imagined. Dozens of illegal land grabs, fraudulent auctions, and backdoor deals with corrupt county officials. It wasn't just Daniel's land. It was an empire built on stolen soil. Within months, Harlan's executives were indicted on fraud, conspiracy, and corruption charges. Their assets were frozen. Their developments halted. The mighty real estate giant collapsed under the weight of its own greed. But Daniel didn't waste time celebrating, because while Harlan's empire crumbled, he was building something new. He didn't want his land just for himself anymore. With Henry by his side, he brought people together, veterans, the homeless, the very people the system had abandoned. They cleared the debris, planted gardens, and rebuilt from the ground up. By the time the first building was completed, the land had become more than property. It was a home. A safe place, a second chance, a community. One afternoon, as Daniel sat beneath the old oak tree, the only thing that had survived everything, he heard a small voice. "Is this your land?" He turned to see a boy standing nearby, a crayon drawing clutched in his hands, a picture of the land, the tree, and the buildings that now stood strong. Daniel smiled. He looked around, at Henry working on a new shelter, at Joe talking to a group about tenant rights, at Natalie helping an old man fill out legal paperwork, at the people who had fought beside him, who had made this victory possible. Then he looked back at the boy, his smile growing as he pointed to everything around them. "It's ours." Daniel's fight for justice wasn't just his. It was for everyone who's been silenced. If you believe in resilience, truth, and standing up against corruption, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Like this video, comment your thoughts, and share to spread the message. Every story matters. Let's make sure it's heard.